Hear now the first reading from 1 Corinthians 7:29 through 32. It's on page 930 in your Pew Bible. I mean, brothers and sisters, the appointed time has grown short. From now on, let even those who have wives be as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no possessions, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. I want you to be free from anxieties. And then Matthew chapter 24, 29 through 31. It's on page 806. Immediately after the suffering of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other.
The second reading is from the Gospel according to Luke, Luke chapter 23, verses 33, 39 to 43. You can follow along in your Pew Bible pages 859 to 860. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." This is the gospel of the Lord.
A few weeks ago, I was coming home from a conference in North Carolina and was waiting for my flight in the Asheville airport. And as per usual these days, the gate agent announced to us that the flight would be delayed. But the Asheville airport is well appointed with nice rocking chairs like good southern airports are. So I was fine just to wait and read a while. But then the pilot came out, kind of unusual, and took the microphone and told us that the flight would be very delayed by a matter of hours because of a mechanical issue. And we were now projected to take off from Asheville within just a few minutes of the time my connecting flight in Atlanta would be taking off for Boston. So there was no way possible that I would be on that airplane. And the pilot suggested that we all get on the phone and call the airline to try to rebook our connecting flights rather than to do it with the one poor booking agent at the desk. So I called and I got someone on the phone and explained the whole situation to her, and she said, "Oh, don't worry, the pilot can make up time in the air." And I said, "Well, what I'm saying to you is that the pilot already came out and said we wouldn't make it in time. We're not even scheduled to take off from Asheville until 9 p.m., and my flight to Boston from Atlanta leaves at 9:04, and it's an hour to get there, so there's no way I'll make it. It is impossible." And she reassured me, "But what you're not getting is that the pilot can make up time in the air. You'll be fine." And so I just couldn't with her anymore, and so I said, "Okay," and I hung up and called back again in a few minutes to try my luck with a different agent who understood the way time worked and had a less miraculous view of pilots' ability to make up time in the air. It was a ridiculous conversation, but it got me to thinking, what if we could make up time? I mean, what if we could create time? It would be a miraculous thing, wouldn't it? More miraculous than a 4-minute flight from Asheville to Atlanta. Because I've heard you all say this before. In fact, Martha said it last week in Forum on reparations. She said time is one of her most precious and valuable resources. I've heard you all say that kind of thing time and time again. Time is so precious and valuable. And questions of time and temporality and questions of past and present and especially future consume us just about all the time. If you listen closely for them, you'll hear those questions. Deliberations over the collapse of the climate, prompting us to think about how much time remains to do something, to reduce climate carbon emissions, to slow global warming, and what the future will be like for those species who survive to see it. And for many of you, time has been marked for the last 3 years by how much time remains until the 2020 elections. It's the only marker of time that seems to matter to a lot of folks. And more personally, how you're going to use time, whether by spending more time in the lab or more time going on dates with your significant other, whether you need to move closer to a loved one so you can spend more time with them, how much time you can squeeze in with your grandparents on their very short visit to town, or your grandkids on their very short visit to town, and what diet you can eat so that you can live longer and have more time, and on and on. And of course, the question, how do we relate to time as a congregation? That's a pertinent question for a congregation in the midst of its 175th year celebration of ministry, thinking about our own past and present and future possibilities. We can hardly get around these kinds of questions in a culture as time-obsessed as ours. But we rarely ask the questions about the terms of the questions themselves. For example, what is time? And how do we relate to it? And just so you know, I'm not going off on some science fiction flight of fantasy again. I didn't mean to say again, actually, that wasn't written there. This is the kind of a question that occupies the minds of many scientists and fills the halls of physics conferences with electric conversation. I read an article this week describing one such conference in which questions like these were addressed by the physicists there. Is the universe a fixed block where what we think of as past, present, and future all already exist and time only appears to pass? Is time directed by thermodynamics, or is it directed by gravity, with matter clumping together so that the growth of complexity points the arrow of time into what we think of as the future? Do past physical states in the universe dictate future states? Or does quantum uncertainty do away with that deterministic view of past and future for good? Is the universe one long continuous whole, like it would seem from looking at it on a macro level, or is it made up on an infinitesimal level of discrete units of space-time that get linked together with adjacent units in order to give us what we think of as time? All that to say, time is more complex than we typically conceive it. So I'm not just rambling about science fiction fantasies up here. These are genuine questions for physicists interested in the quote-unquote reality that we quote-unquote call time. And they're questions that are now and have long been pertinent for interpreters of the Christian faith as well. So speaking of time, let's locate ourselves within one way of conceiving it. Today is the last day on the Christian liturgical calendar, the way by which we measure time in the church. We begin in Advent, which starts next Sunday, And we end every year with a relatively new holy day called Reign of Christ Sunday. In the Catholic tradition, the celebration, which is called the Solemnity of our Lord Jesus Christ, King of the Universe, I like their name better, was added to the liturgical calendar by Pope Pius XI in 1925. Relatively new on the Catholic Church's span of time. And in 1969, Pope Paul the Sixth moved the date to the final Sunday of the liturgical year and assigned it the highest rank of solemnity. The Evangelical Lutheran Church of Sweden has a different name for this day, which I like even better than the Catholic one. They call it the Sunday of Doom, which we will be celebrating next year now that I've discovered this. It is a day meant to highlight the eschatological return of Christ and the culmination of all things. And for us, a very specific celebration on the OCBC calendar, this is Ingathering, the Sunday when we make our pledges of financial gifts to the ministry of the church for the coming calendar year. In the text we've read this morning, you can see these themes coming through. Now, the only one of the texts that William and Naro read that is actually assigned by the lectionary for this Sunday is the crucifixion scene in Luke, which we read only in part, but it's the least reign of Christ or King of the universe text that you can imagine. The last suffering breaths of Jesus on the cross. And that is the end of the liturgical year. We'd much more expect a text like the Matthew one to culminate this year. Sun and moon darkened, stars falling from the sky, heaven shaken by the coming of Jesus on the clouds. Much more regal, much more grandeur, a real Sunday of doom scripture. And even more so with Paul's admonition in the 1 Corinthians text, the appointed time has grown short, for the present form of this world is passing away. But in each of the texts, notice the place of time. The criminal says to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom," to which Jesus replies, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Immediately after the suffering of those days, the appointed time has grown short, for the present form of this world is passing away. And that last text really intrigues me, because like so many texts of Scripture, the translation is not entirely straightforward. For example, the appointed time has grown short is the text that Christians have read for millennia to suggest the end of time is at hand. But it's actually a bit more complicated than that. The Greek word here could just as well be translated as gathered together, constricted, rather than grown short. Catherine Keller says the verse may be translated better, the time is contracted. The appointed time, that phrase in that verse, so often used to suggest a particular moment in history ordained as the end of time, which so many people have tried to get right on the calendar for 2 millennia, the appointed time may just as well be translated remaining time. So the remaining time is contracted, or the remaining time has been gathered up, because the present form of this world is passing away, or translated another way with just one Greek word left in the original language, the present schema of the cosmos is coming to an end. So now we see it's not just physicists who are intrigued by time. And if you think working your way through the inquiry of quantum physicists into the nature of time is head-spinning, our English translations of the Bible have been hiding something almost as dizzying. When it comes to all of those times in the text that you've encountered the word time, never knowing that it is more complicated than that. The remaining time has been gathered up. The present schema of the cosmos is coming to an end. But there are two words for time in the Greek New Testament. There's chronos, which is much more akin to the way we think about time as measured via a clock or a calendar. It's the word you use if you were determining when you would meet someone or arrive at some place, which date to mark on the calendar as the date that something happened, chronos. But that's not the word Paul uses here. The remaining time has been gathered up. He doesn't say the appointed chronos time has grown short. He says the appointed kairos time has been gathered up, contracted. The present schema of the cosmos is coming to an end. Now, here's how the entry for kairos begins in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. And if you don't know, what makes for a good sermon is quoting from a 10-volume dictionary of the New Testament. So here it is, though. It's intriguing. Kairos. There is no certainty as to its original meaning. Etymological research has produced different conclusions. Nevertheless, the linguistic development of the term clearly suggests that the basic sense is that of the decisive or crucial place or point, whether spatially, materially, or temporally. Okay, so this is starting to sound more like philosophical musings on quantum physics than on biblical studies now. Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben sees this passage indicating that everyday regular chronos time, the clock, the calendar time, everyday regular time is undergoing an entirely transformative contraction. And New Testament scholar Alexandra Brown explains this text from Paul, saying, linear time is contracted so that the present and the past fold into one another to create a new temporality, neither past nor present. A temporality Paul defines graphically as the end of days. She goes on, against the anxious fragmentation of the self in time, Paul sets divine eternity, pictured as the ingathering activity of God against temporal fragmentation. The ingathering activity of God against temporal fragmentation. So I'm going to ask you the question again that you thought was just utter silliness when I first asked it. What would it mean if we could make up time? If we could create time? What if we could perceive a time, kairos, that isn't there in time, chronos? I've been playing with that notion the past few days. It's not just a question for sci-fi fantasy or even for quantum physicists at conferences. It's a theological question for people striving to live out the way of Jesus. How do we value time but not be beholden to it? At least not be beholden to chronos, in order to be more responsive to the kairos. Not the precise time, but the decisive time. The ingathering activity of God against temporal fragmentation. Think of that particular ingathering activity of God for a moment. Time gathered up, contracted, bringing the present schema of the cosmos to an end, defying fragmentation of the self in time, a refusal to calendar our lives by election dates or deadlines or even death. What if we could make up time, if we could create time, if we could perceive a time that isn't there in time? Here are some ways I can imagine it happening. A congregation of people some of whom are youthful with presumably many decades of life ahead, others of whom are old and with few years remaining, all gathered up, contracted together in one place, so that the chronos time frame of that collective seems to expand in multitudinous kairos ways beyond what any single person could imagine. So that in this one ingathered, contracted together community, time stretches nearly 100 years into the past and another 100 years into the future. In that gathered up, contracted way, the lifespan of this congregation, sitting in this room and downstairs in the Sunday school room today, is actually older, past, present, and future combined, than the linear chronos lifespan of this congregation to date. And on Ingathering Sunday, when we bring our pledges of financial giving to the altar for the coming year of ministry, we do so based on a fiscal calendar so that we can create a budget for the 12-month time frame called 2020. But think of it differently as another kind of ingathering. The appointed time has been gathered up, ingathering, in such a way that we might see through the 12-month chronos in front of us, to perceive an opening of kairos appearing within the chronos, an opening of opportune time for which we are planning and funding, an entirely transformative contraction of the ingathering activity of God against temporal fragmentation. The remaining kairos has been gathered up, and the present schema of the cosmos is coming to an end. I guess ultimately, through all the quantum physics and Italian philosophy and Greek linguistic study, all I really want is for the next time I'm stranded in an airport far away with no chance of making my connecting flight, and the booking agent tells me that there's still a possibility that you can make up time in the air, that I'll have the theological imagination to say, well, hell, maybe so.